Pfizers försök att ta över Astra Zeneca skapade ju väldigt mycket debatt i Sverige. Svallvågorna gick nästan ännu högre här i Storbritannien där vi befinner oss idag för att ta reda på vad två av världens mest inflytelserika ekonomitidningar, The Economist och The Financial Times, tänker både kring Pfizer och Astra Zeneca men även kring de större frågeställningarna om finns det ett nationellt intresse som bör försvaras i en globaliserad ekonomi eller inte? Pfizer's bid for AstraZeneca has caused huge debate both in Britain and in Sweden this year. You have written that this is not merely a question about one pharmaceutical company trying to swallow another, but that it sort of puts important questions about the role of companies and who owns and who controls the company to light. In what way?
Well, we have a sort of fundamental conceptual questions about what companies are and whether one should think of them as being owned in the way that a corner shop is owned, and therefore whether shareholders should have the right to control them freely without constraint on their ability to dispose of them. Shareholders are the least, of all the people engaged in a company, they're the ones with the smallest long-term commitment because shares are very liquid. They're on the whole very diversified holders of shares, so that they as it were pay the least cost if the company fails compared with the workers or the localities where they're located. They have probably of all the people committed to the firm the least understanding of what a company's possibilities are in the long run. Most shareholders are sort of rationally ignorant about the company because ultimately all they're interested in is what happens to the price, and of course for this reason it's very easy for the corporate management to manipulate the understanding of the shareholders. For all these reasons you have to ask yourself, is it the case that if shareholder rights are absolute, they can sell companies freely, and if they become the prime target of the way the company is run, you have to ask, is this going to be efficient? Are these going to be the most efficient companies? And if you look around the world, it's not immediately obvious that they are. So I was raising what I recognize is a profound question. Should we consider companies to be something that's simply bought and sold by shareholders and really nobody else much matters?
Like a sack of potato.
Like a sack of potatoes.
So
exactly.
It's not just up to the shareholders. Were you surprised that the big bid didn't go through?
No, because we do have, fortunately, a reasonably good takeover panel. They had said they didn't want to make it a contested takeover, so that bound them in certain ways. I'm not an expert on this, but it bound them. And clearly a lot of shareholders decided, quite reasonably, that yes, they probably own shares on both sides, so maybe they would do a bit better on their AstraZeneca shares but less well on their Pfizer shares, or they thought that AstraZeneca would do even better on its own than managed by Pfizer, because Pfizer's reputation as a manager of the assets it has bought is sort of very debatable. It's been debated. So for these reasons, they just didn't get enough shareholders to sell. And of course, politically, it was very, very sensitive in the UK, and I know in Sweden too, because here's this giant company, which is very important to our economies, and Pfizer's not a company whose reputation was so strong that people felt they had to sell it. And then there was this fact about the tax reasons, which of course was attractive to Pfizer and perhaps not unattractive to the British government. After all, it had created this opportunity. But to have a huge merger occur with such extraordinary implications in such a sensitive sector, just for tax reasons, seemed sort of rather doubtful. And so for all these reasons.
And it seemed to reflect something a little bit new in British politics. Britain is normally a very, very, very free trading nation, open to foreign investment, and something happened in the Pfizer bid that got people thinking in quite a different way.
And what was that?
Well, I think really a couple of things. One is that Pfizer was presented as a sort of unusually rapacious company, big American company, wants to come and take over small, powerless British company. But I think something else too, what has happened in the last few years in Britain is that politicians haven't become more protectionist in the French way, but they've become more protective of companies that do a lot of exporting, because our export performance has been very, very, very poor over the past few years. We all now think that we need more export in order to pay our way in the world, and so we've become more protective of businesses that do a lot of exporting. And Astra Zeneca accounts for about 2% of British exports just on its own.
Initially, the British government seemed quite positive towards this bid, right? Or?
Yes, they were. George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, cut corporation tax. He's cut it several times, and he's done this in order that more foreign businesses come to Britain. And so when it was first revealed that Pfizer was approaching AstraZeneca, the government was delighted. It seemed as though here was a big company that was proving the case that they had put forward, that Britain is a very business-friendly place.
And then the debate turned around. It was not about the corporation tax suddenly. It was about, what would you say it was about? It was about the nature of this company, of Pfizer, or was it something more in general?
I think it was about the nature of Pfizer and AstraZeneca. It's a little bit odd. I think, and I have no evidence for this, but I think that most British people had never heard of AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca in Britain is not like Rolls-Royce or British Airways. It's not a big, well-known company. It only employs 7,000 researchers in this country. But Pfizer is a better-known company, and it was very quickly painted as a big, cost-cutting, thoughtless American company.
There was, in my view at least, an interesting difference in tone from the Swedish and the British government, because initially the British government was quite happy about this and almost bragging that this big American pharmaceutical company was interested in Britain. And then the tone sort of slightly changed, but it was not the same kind of comments as came from the Swedish finance minister, Anders Borg, who was very critical. Do you think the British government will change tone if Pfizer comes back, or are they surprised by the big debate around these issues?
Well, first of all, I was surprised by Anders Borg's reaction.
Yeah.
I've met him on many occasions. I consider him a strong free marketeer,
well,
and he always talks as if he is one. So I had expected him to take a rather different attitude from the one he did. I can't understand there are particular political contexts.
I think there was also Pharmacia in 2002 that Sweden has sort of a bad. He remembers that the promises that they made then, and with that deal, and I think that was part of it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I do know, I've seen these, that the promises people make in a takeover battle are worth nothing, absolutely nothing, even if they're signed in blood, as it were. I mean, this always changes, and inevitably so. So he's right. But I was surprised by that. So I was surprised by the divergence. I regard the current Swedish government as probably the government whose views on economics are closest to those of our government of any European country. So I was quite surprised by this division which you've described. I think the British government was taken aback by the domestic reaction. It thought it had a sort of fairly standard British view. We've created a tax system to encourage inward investment. We think the market should decide these things freely. That's been very much the British view for a long time. So this company came along, it offered money, partly because of our very generous tax arrangements. That's exactly what we wanted. So I think the British government's response, at least the Conservative part of the coalition's response, was, as it were, almost normal for the British. And I think they were probably surprised at how much adverse reaction there was. And I think what they haven't taken on board, though I can't be sure of this, is that the mood here about the idea that the financial markets always know best, because this is an aspect, the financial markets always know best, it's really changed a bit since the financial crisis. People don't believe that quite as instinctively as before. And then people say, well, yes, but this is really an enormous part of our economy, this company. Are we sure Pfizer would manage it better? And then people start looking at Pfizer and they say, well, no, we're not really sure. So I think the British government shouldn't have been surprised, but I suspect it was. And I know there were some differences of opinion within the government, certainly difference of flavour on opinion on this. And it will be a little bit more difficult to be gung-ho about these things in future. Nonetheless, I would expect certainly the Conservative Party and this government to remain strongly pro-takeovers, pro-stock stock owner capitalism, shareholder capitalism, and not to express much doubt about it.
And The Economist, you were quite supportive of this bid, and you more or less recommended Astra Zeneca to take it, right?
Yes, I think we didn't think it was a great bid. We didn't think this was going to be like Tata coming in and buying Jaguar Land Rover and turning it into a brilliant company. We recognised that this would have been a deal done for tax reasons. It would have lowered Pfizer's tax bill.
And isn't that a problem?
It's a reason to find the bid not great, but in our view, it wasn't a reason to rule it out altogether. So I suppose what we really thought is that this was in a way, a fairly lousy bid, which the government had no place getting in the way of. So in other words, we thought the damage that would be done from standing in the way of this bid would be greater than the damage that would be done by allowing the bid to go ahead.
There are a few industries which I think are central to our future in different ways, where I think nationality really matters. Banks, for example. To be honest, there are people, companies whom I would rather not see own our major banks. Pretty fundamental questions about how those will be run. They're not run very well now, but there are problems with that. The pharmaceutical industry is a core industry for the future of this country. There's no doubt about it. We don't need to say they should all be owned by British people, because I think that's ridiculous, and I have no problem with foreign ownership of these businesses. But we should be interested in whether the people who own them will run them in a way that will be beneficial to us. I think that's true of aerospace, particularly when it involves defence, but I'm certainly interested in who owns Rolls-Royce. It seems to me very difficult to imagine that it wouldn't matter to the British whether Rolls-Royce remains a British company. Well, we might decide that it isn't, but at least I'd like to look at it before we just say somebody whom we don't know.
Volvo is Chinese?
Yes, well, Volvo is less important to Sweden, I would say. No, Jaguar is now Indian, and that's been absolutely unproblematic, and I would have supported that takeover very, very strongly. But I think it's something one would have to look at. Chocolate, as I said, not important. I don't really care about oil and gas. But I'm just saying it's one of the things. There is, I think, a national interest aspect to the question of ownership. Are the people suitable? Are the people going to develop the assets? Are the people going to operate this in a way that will be beneficial to our economy? I think it's a perfectly legitimate set of questions to ask. And as I said, for exactly the same way that I take the view that states have the right to decide, within some reason, how you deal with migrants, I think the same applies to the migration of ownership.
The fact that Britain is receptive to foreign takeovers makes all British companies more valuable. And so if it becomes clear to investors that Britain is turning even a little bit more protectionist, then that sense goes away. And so that harms all of British business.
But aren't most countries more protectionist than Britain in this sense?
Yes, they absolutely are.
And they still seem to have an economy that works.
Yes, they absolutely are. Yes, I think this also speaks to something else that has been changing in Britain, which is that, all right, so there are three kinds of mergers that can occur, of course, in Britain. There's a British company buying another British company, there's a British company buying a foreign company, and then there's a foreign company buying a British company. And what has happened over the last few years, particularly since the Great Recession, is that the first two have become much, much rarer. So there are many, many fewer British companies buying other British companies, and there are many fewer British companies buying foreign companies. Foreign companies buying British companies, the number has gone down a little bit, but not as much as the other two kinds. And so there's a sense, I think, which politicians are picking up on, that the whole thing has become unbalanced, that we are more receptive to foreign companies wanting to buy our companies than other countries are to British companies buying their companies. We've got the sense that it's a little bit unfair, it's a little bit unbalanced, and I think that is leading us also to become a little bit more nervous, a little bit more hesitant, and a little bit more protectionist.
And if you look around the world at countries with large, successful corporate sectors, they have a number of different ways of dealing with this. In some countries, notably in East Asia, if you look at Korea or Japan, the buying and selling of a major company is simply inconceivable. It just wouldn't be allowed to happen. It's socially unacceptable. In Germany, effectively the same is true for the major companies, but it's done partly through the law that creates the two-tier corporate structure, partly because in some very important companies, actually government organizations own large shareholdings, and sometimes it's just sort of tacit understanding. Effectively, you know very, very well that you couldn't buy and sell Daimler-Benz. If anybody came along, the chances of being allowed to buy Daimler-Benz are simply zero. Nobody would allow it unless it were another German company. And even then it would probably be very difficult. In other countries like Sweden, you have the Wallenbergs, you have different shareholder rights, so there are differing voting shares depending on how committed the owners are. And you could, of course, coming back to that, have voting rights which depend on how long you own a share. So it seems to me it would be quite reasonable, for example, to say that you need to own a share for a year before you have voting rights. There are many different ways you could imagine this. The basic point is that property rights in companies are exercised, as a matter of fact, in very different ways around the world, among countries that have very effective companies. You can't buy or sell Samsung, but it's clearly a very successful company. And we could clearly think of alternative arrangements to the sort of standard Anglo-Saxon view that you can buy and sell them freely. Though actually I have to tell you, the US is, under US law, particularly Delaware law, there are far more opportunities to obstruct the buying and selling of shares than there will be in the UK, which is very much at the free market end. So the issue of how to structure this, the answer to that is, can be done in many, many ways, and they might well be better than what we in the UK have.
We need to separate national interest from national champions. We should not be trying to defend companies against foreign takeovers. Instead, what we should be doing is, for example, in pharmaceuticals, we should be trying to make it as advantageous as possible to be in Britain. So if Pfizer had got control of Astra Zeneca, or if it comes back in a year's time and it gets control of Astra Zeneca, what we should try to ensure is that the combined company invests as much as possible in Britain. And that has to do with things like making sure your universities are producing the right kind of scientists, making sure you have good tax breaks, making sure you have good, quite liberal immigration laws so that you can get scientists to come into the country instead of keeping them out. That sort of thing. That I think is what a country, is what a government should be focusing on.
Do you think Pfizer will come back?
I'm not at all sure. It's very hard to predict. A big company like Pfizer will have suffered a little bit of reputational damage from the fiasco that occurred a few weeks ago, having to come in and answer questions by MPs and so on. But they're sufficiently big that it won't have done them very much damage. The American tax situation is so distorted that Pfizer has a very, very, very good reason to want to come back, so it may try again.
My impression, and I don't claim expertise here, is that Pfizer needed the deal. It's sort of what it does as a company. It's been buying companies in order to strip out costs and raise its profits in the short to medium run, and then it moves on. It's not an innovative company. It's not a very innovative company as far as I can see. So it would not be very surprising if Pfizer were to come back to this deal, and it might still happen.
So in Sweden, we almost have an emotional debate about losing these big companies. Volvo is Chinese, Scania has now been bought by, or is now being bought by Volkswagen. Would you say that these sort of emotions that occur are irrational, or is there something there? Should a country be worried when brands or companies that you think about as your own leave and move abroad and are bought up by someone else?
Well, it's partly rational and it's partly not rational. It's not rational, I think, to try to defend big companies simply because you feel emotionally attached to them. It is rational to defend them, though, because big companies are very, very good, often, not always. They're very, very good for an economy because they maintain very, very, very large supply chains. They do a lot of research and development, and there is something of what is known as the home country bias in research and development. In other words, if a company is headquartered in a country, it seems to do somewhat more research and development in that country than you might expect, given where its markets are. And so it is useful to hold on to big operations for that reason, but holding on to big operations and holding on to the domicile of a big company are two quite different things.
How do you hold on to them if you want to?
Well, you simply hold on to them by making it as attractive as possible for these big companies to have big operations in your country and to do a lot of research in your country. And you do that through tax breaks, you do that through education to have the right people in the country, and things like that. I think that is a better course than a kind of traditional economic nationalism in which you try to defend large companies.
Why?
Because it doesn't matter ultimately where a company is domiciled. What it matters, right? We don't care about companies. We care about people. We care about jobs. We care about employment, and we care about income to the state. And so, what we should want is kind of companies doing their work in a country. So, for example, it is very, very good, clearly, that Jaguar Land Rover was bought by an Indian company. That has been an incredibly good thing for that company. It does now a lot of research in Britain. It's a very, very big exporter. It's very, very hard to argue, I think, that was a bad move for Britain.
Do you feel lonely in these opinions? Do you feel like the debate is moving in another direction, in a more sort of protectionist direction in Europe as a whole?
I don't think so incredibly strongly. I mean, Britain and the Netherlands have always been peculiarly calm about other companies buying their sort of champions.
And Sweden sort of calm as well, I would say.
Yes. I don't think the whole of Europe is sort of becoming French, but I do think you do see little gestures towards it. Really, the question, I think, is when the economies of Europe finally turn around again and everybody becomes more confident and the home markets start to improve and all the rest of it, have we locked in measures that close off our economies? So during the Pfizer Astra Zeneca fracas, there were quite serious proposals to declare pharmaceuticals an industry of national strategic importance in Britain, like defence and media. If you think that pharmaceuticals are of national strategic importance in Britain, you think lots of things are of national strategic importance. And so I did worry that we would go quite quickly down a route where we are designating all sorts of industries as being deserving of special protection. But we haven't gone down that route yet.
Det var ju två väldigt intressanta och väldigt olika perspektiv på de här frågorna. Ni ska ha stort tack för att ni har tittat och vi ses snart igen.